In the autumn of 1693, in the Alsace region near the border of Switzerland and France, an Anabaptist elder named Jakob Ammann stood in front of a room of ministers and told them the church of Menno Simons had gone soft. Ammann wanted stricter shunning of the excommunicated, the practice known inside the church as Meidung. He wanted foot washing built into the twice-yearly communion service. He wanted the plain and separated life kept plain and separated, no drift, no easing toward the customs of the world outside the fence line. Some ministers agreed with him, most did not, and the argument that followed was not settled quietly. Letters went back and forth across Switzerland and the Palatinate for months. Congregations split mid-sentence. Families who had worshipped together for a generation found themselves standing on opposite sides of a line that Ammann himself had drawn, and within a few short years that line had hardened into something no apology or reconciliation could undo. Nobody in that room knew it yet, but they had just decided which name their great-great-great-grandchildren would carry 3 centuries later, an ocean away, in counties they had never heard of. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Menno Simons himself had never met Jakob Ammann. He had been dead for over a century by the time of the 1693 argument. Simons was a Catholic priest in Friesland, in the northern Netherlands, who left the priesthood in 1536, only a year after a radical Anabaptist uprising at the German city of Munster ended in a bloody siege and mass execution that gave the entire Anabaptist movement a reputation for violence it did not deserve outside that one splinter group. Simons spent the rest of his life rebuilding the movement's reputation around nonviolence, adult baptism, and separation from worldly government, traveling and preaching under threat of arrest until his death in 1561. His followers took his name informally at first, then permanently, long before any of them had crossed an ocean or heard of a Swiss elder named Ammann. By the time the dust settled, the movement that had begun with Menno Simons in the Netherlands more than a century and a half earlier had split into 2 churches that still share a language, a homeland, a set of hymnals, and in a great many cases a family tree, but not a name. The ones who followed Ammann into the stricter path became the Amish. The ones who stayed with the older, slightly less severe tradition kept the name of the man who had come before Ammann entirely, Menno Simons himself, and they became the Mennonites. Neither group vanished, neither group won. They simply stopped being one church and became 2, permanently, and the surnames carried by the people in that room in 1693 are, in many documented cases, still sorted the same way today, on the same handful of church district lists, in the same handful of counties, generation after generation after generation. Both groups crossed the Atlantic together in the 1700s. They sailed from Rotterdam on the same ships, sat in the same crowded holds, landed at the same Philadelphia docks, and paid the same colonial officials for the same land grants in the same limestone valleys of Lancaster County and Berks County before later generations pushed west into Ohio, Indiana, and beyond. Their surnames traveled together too, packed into the same trunks, written down by the same ship's clerks who rarely spelled a German name the same way twice. A Yoder family and a Herr family may have stood on the same crowded deck during the same 6-week crossing and never once imagined that 3 centuries later their descendants would be sorted by outsiders into 2 entirely separate religious worlds, plain coat against no coat, horse and buggy against automobile, based on nothing more than which side of a Swiss church argument their ancestor happened to land on. If your last name traces back to German-speaking Switzerland, the Palatinate, or Alsace, and it turns up in Pennsylvania church registers and land deeds before the American Revolution, there is a real chance it belongs distinctly to one side of that split or the other, and the paper trail that decides which side is often more consistent and more traceable than most families realize, running unbroken through baptismal records, ship manifests, and church district minutes that survived fires, floods, and 2.5 centuries of American weather. Here are 19 of those names, most of them settling firmly into one church and staying there for 300 years, plus one that refuses to sort cleanly at all, along with the documented history sitting underneath each one. Yoder, Amish. The name comes from Yoder, a surname recorded in the cantons around Bern as early as the 1500s, generations before anyone in that family had ever heard of Jakob Ammann or his argument about shunning. When Swiss and Palatine German Anabaptists began crossing to Pennsylvania in the early 1700s, Yoder became Yoder somewhere on the voyage or shortly after landing, the way so many German surnames picked up an anglicized spelling once a county clerk had to write them into a deed book or a tax list. Today, Yoder is, by a wide margin, the single most common surname among Old Order Amish families in North America. It clusters heavily in Holmes County, Ohio, home to the largest Amish population in the world, in LaGrange and Elkhart counties in northern Indiana, and in the older Lancaster County settlements where the whole American story began. The name became so common in some rural areas that a small farming town in Reno County, Kansas, settled largely by Amish and Mennonite families, was named Yoder outright. Amish genealogists have spent decades tracing the branches of this one surname back to a small handful of Swiss immigrant ancestors, and the resulting family charts are so dense that entire published directories exist just to sort one Yoder line from another. If your own name happens to be Yoder, the odds are strong that somewhere back along that line, an ancestor chose the stricter path in the 1793 argument, and the family never looked back. Herr Mennonite. Hans Herr left Switzerland with a small group of persecuted Mennonite families and arrived in Pennsylvania in 1710, part of one of the earliest organized Mennonite settlements anywhere in the American colonies. He was elected the first Mennonite bishop in Lancaster County not long after the group arrived, and his son Christian built the family homestead in 1719, a stone farmhouse that still stands today and is preserved as the Hans Herr House, the oldest surviving building in Lancaster County and one of the oldest Mennonite meeting houses anywhere in America. Visitors can walk through the same rooms where that first congregation gathered to worship 300 years ago, under the care of the Lancaster Mennonite Historical Society, which has maintained the site for decades. The Herr name never crossed over into the Amish church. It stayed inside the Mennonite tradition through generation after generation, and it remains one of the most recognizable Mennonite surnames in Pennsylvania to this day. If your name is Herr, the record does not leave much room for doubt about which side of the split your family landed on. Stoltzfus, Amish. Nicholas Stoltzfus was not born into an Anabaptist family at all. He was raised Lutheran in the German homeland, arrived in Philadelphia in 1766, and married into an established Amish community shortly after, converting to the Amish faith in a decision that would echo through American genealogy in a way almost nobody at the time could have predicted. Nicholas Stoltzfus is now recognized, through generations of documented church and family records, as the common ancestor of nearly every Stoltzfus, Stoltzfus, and Stouffer family within the Amish world today. Researchers who specialize in Amish family lines describe the Stoltzfus descendants as one of the largest single ancestor family networks in American religious history, spread now across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and dozens of smaller settlements. The name is so concentrated in Lancaster County today that several long-running local businesses, from meat markets to bakeries frequented by tourists visiting the region, still carry it on their storefronts. A convert from entirely outside the faith became, over 2.5 centuries, the shared root of an entire surname's worth of Amish families numbering in the tens of thousands. Fisher. Amish in Lancaster County specifically. Fisher is a straightforward anglicization of the German Fischer, and it settled into the Old Order Amish community of Lancaster County so thoroughly that by the 20th century it stood alongside Stoltzfus and Byler as one of the 3 most common surnames inside that single settlement. Amish church directories from Lancaster list page after page of Fisher households, and because the name is so densely concentrated in one place rather than spread thin across many settlements the way Yoder is, local genealogists sometimes describe it as one of the clearest markers of a specifically Lancaster County Amish lineage rather than an Ohio or Indiana one. The German Fisher surname exists among Mennonites too, scattered here and there, but the Lancaster County concentration tips this particular name firmly toward the Amish side. Church district lists from the settlement's early 20th century record-keeping show entire townships where a majority of the farms belonged to one Fisher family or another, distinguished from each other only by a bishop's first name or a farm's location along a particular pike road. Landis. Mennonite. The Landis family arrived among the earliest wave of Swiss Mennonite settlers in Lancaster County in the early 1700s, and the name became so tied to the region's Mennonite farming heritage that it eventually gave its name to an entire piece of American cultural history. 2 brothers from the family, Henry and George Landis, spent decades in the early 20th century collecting Pennsylvania Dutch farm tools, furniture, and household objects, and their collection became the founding core of the Landis Valley Museum near Lancaster, a living history farm museum still operated by the state today and dedicated to preserving exactly the rural Pennsylvania German culture their own Mennonite ancestors had helped build 2 centuries earlier. Few surnames on this list have a public museum standing as a monument to the family that carried it, and fewer still can point to a working 19th century farmstead, open to the public year-round, as the physical proof of exactly where their ancestors stood in the Mennonite half of this split: King, Amish. Long before it became one of the most common surnames in the Elkhart-LaGrange settlement of northern Indiana, one of the largest Amish communities outside Ohio, the name began in the Old Country as Quincy or Koenig, gradually anglicized generation by generation in tax lists and church records until the German word for a monarch simply became the plain English one. Church directories from that Indiana settlement list king families intermarried repeatedly with Yoders, Bontragers, and Millers across more than 2 centuries of shared farmland, and the name today is treated by settlement historians as one of the clearest markers of an Indiana Amish lineage specifically, distinct from the Lancaster County concentration of Fisher and Byler. Bontrager, Amish. The exact Swiss form of the name is less settled in the historical record than some of the others on this list, and where the paper trail thins out, it is worth saying so rather than inventing a tidy origin story. What the record does show clearly is the settlement pattern. Bontrager families concentrated heavily in the same Elkhart-LaGrange corner of northern Indiana as the Kings, appearing repeatedly in church district lists and land records from the 1800s onward, and today it remains one of the surnames most closely identified with that specific Indiana settlement, rather than with Ohio or Pennsylvania. A thin origin story with a dense settlement record is still a documented lineage, even when one half of the picture stays harder to pin down than the other. Now for a name carrying a darker story than most of the others on this list. Hochstetler, sometimes written Hostetler depending on the branch. Amish, at its origin. In September of 1757, in the middle of the French and Indian War, a raiding party attacked the farm of Jakob Hochstetler in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Jacob's sons had loaded weapons inside the house and were ready and willing to defend the family. Jacob, holding firmly to the Anabaptist conviction of non-resistance, would not let them fire a shot. The house was burned to the ground. Jacob's wife and 2 of his children were killed in the attack, and 2 of his sons, Joseph and Christian, were taken captive and lived among their captors for years before eventually finding their way back to what remained of their family. The story became one of the defining accounts of Anabaptist non-resistance in colonial America, documented in family papers and later compiled in detail by the Hochstetler Family Association, which still tracks descendants of that farm and holds reunions today. Those descendants split across both Amish and Mennonite lines in the generations that followed, with the Hochstetler spelling remaining more common in Amish communities and Hostetler appearing across both traditions. But the origin point, a father who would not let his sons shoot, sits underneath every single branch of that family regardless of which church it eventually settled into. The association's reunions, held periodically in Pennsylvania to this day, draw descendants from both church traditions back to roughly the same stretch of Berks County ground where the farmhouse once stood. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Funk, Mennonite. Heinrich Funk, generally written in English records as Henry Funk, was ordained around 1738 as the first Mennonite bishop born on American soil, serving the Franconia region of what is now Montgomery and Bucks counties in Pennsylvania. He wrote and helped preserve some of the earliest Mennonite religious texts printed anywhere in the colonies, including catechisms used to instruct the next generation of the church in doctrine and discipline. The Funk surname remained heavily concentrated within the Franconia Mennonite Conference for generations after his death, and it is still one of the most recognizable names inside that particular branch of the Mennonite Church today, carried by families who trace their line to a bishop building an American Mennonite identity before the country he was building it inside had even declared independence. Funk's own writings survive in reprinted form to this day, studied in Mennonite historical circles as some of the earliest theological work produced by any Anabaptist community on the American continent. Byler, also written Byler depending on the family. Amish. Jakob Byler was among the early Amish immigrants who settled in Lancaster County, and his descendants became so numerous within the Old Order Amish community that an entire church affiliation, informally referred to by genealogists and church historians as the Byler Amish, eventually took shape around families descended from a later Byler bishop in the 1800s. The Byler and Byler spellings both persist today, sometimes appearing within the same extended family depending on which branch made the choice, and both are considered among the most concentrated surnames in Lancaster County's Amish community. Drive through the towns of Bird in Hand or Intercourse in Lancaster County today, and the mailboxes along the back roads will confirm it without a single record needing to be pulled. Groff, Mennonite. The name descends from the German Graf, carried into Pennsylvania by Swiss and Palatine Mennonite families in the early to mid-1700s who settled in Lancaster County alongside the Herrs, the Landises, and the Brubakers. The Groff name stayed close to its Pennsylvania Dutch and Mennonite roots for centuries, and today it is attached to one of the region's best-known culinary landmarks, Groff's Farm Restaurant in Mount Joy. Founded by Betty Groff on land her husband's Mennonite ancestors had farmed since the colonial period, serving recipes that trace directly back to the farmhouse kitchens of those original 18th century settlers. Troyer, Amish. The name is believed to descend from the Swiss surname Dreyer or Treyer, and Troyer families settled heavily into the Holmes County, Ohio Amish community that grew into the largest Amish population anywhere in the world. Church record books from Holmes County list generation after generation of Troyer households, intermarried repeatedly with the Yoders, the Millers, and the Hershbergers who settled the same townships in the same decades. Because the name concentrated so specifically in Ohio, rather than spreading evenly across Pennsylvania and Indiana the way some other Amish surnames did, a Troyer family history often points a genealogist toward one particular corner of Ohio farmland before any other record even needs to be checked. Hershberger, Amish. Descended from the German Hershberger, a name tied to a place description rather than an occupation, roughly a settler from a mountain or hillside associated with deer, the family became one of the anchor surnames of the Holmes County Amish settlement alongside the Troyers and the Yoders, appearing in the same church districts and the same intermarried family lines generation after generation. Holmes County remains to this day the largest concentration of Amish population anywhere on earth, and a surname this deeply embedded in its founding families carries that weight even for a Hershberger who has never lived within 100 miles of Ohio. Eby, Mennonite. Theophilus Eby and his brother Peter arrived among the early Swiss Mennonite settlers of Lancaster County in the early 1700s, and the family became prolific enough within the church that a dedicated genealogical volume, a biographical history of the Eby family, was compiled in the early 20th century to track its many branches. The Eby name remained tied to Mennonite congregations in Lancaster and later Waterloo County in Ontario, where a wave of Pennsylvania Mennonites resettled after the Revolution rather than take an oath of allegiance to a new government, a migration that carried Mennonite surnames like Eby across an international border, while the Amish, by contrast, largely stayed put in the United States. Waterloo County today still holds one of the largest concentrations of Mennonite surnames anywhere outside Pennsylvania, Eby prominent among them on street signs, cemetery gates, and the membership rolls of meeting houses that have never once used the word Amish to describe themselves. Weaver, Mennonite. The anglicized form of the German Weber, Weaver settled heavily among Mennonite congregations of the Shenandoah Valley in Virginia, as well as the Franconia and Lancaster conferences of Pennsylvania, one of the surnames that shows up repeatedly in the founding records of Virginia's own separate Mennonite migration in the mid-1700s. The Weaver name does appear among some Amish families too, but its heaviest concentration sits inside Mennonite conference records rather than Old Order Amish church directories, and Shenandoah Valley Mennonite historians treat it as one of the defining surnames of that specific southern branch of the migration, a branch that developed its own distinct dialect and farming customs separate from the Pennsylvania settlements, even as it kept the same church discipline. Kauffman, Mennonite in its most historically documented branch. The name descends from the German Kaufmann, meaning merchant, and while Kauffman families settled across several Anabaptist communities in Pennsylvania and later the Midwest, one branch that migrated to Kansas in the 1870s became closely tied to Bethel College, a Mennonite institution founded in North Newton whose Kauffman Museum still preserves the material culture of that prairie Mennonite migration today, farm implements, Bibles, and household goods carried west by families who had crossed an ocean once already and were prepared to cross half a continent to keep their church intact. That Kansas settlement grew alongside a much larger 19th century wave of Mennonites arriving separately from Russia and the Prussian territories, a migration story distinct from the earlier Pennsylvania settlers, but one that still answers, in the end, to the same founding name of Menno Simons. Hoover, Mennonite, at least at the start. Andreas Hoover left the German-speaking Palatinate and arrived in Pennsylvania in the late 1730s. part of the wave of Mennonite families fleeing religious pressure in Europe for the relative tolerance offered inside William Penn's colony. The Huber name anglicized to Hoover as the family moved west, first into North Carolina and later into Ohio, and somewhere along that westward drift, several branches of the family left the Mennonite church altogether and joined the Society of Friends, the Quakers. One of those Quaker descendants, born in West Branch, Iowa in 1874, was Herbert Hoover, the 31st President of the United States. His family's Quaker identity is the one American history books remember. Underneath it, several generations back, sits a Mennonite immigrant named Huber who crossed the ocean for the same reason as every other name on this list: the freedom to worship without a government official deciding the terms. Zook, Amish. The name comes from the Swiss surname Zug, and Zook families settled across the same Lancaster County communities, and later the same Holmes County and Elkhart-LaGrange settlements, as the Yoders and the Stoltzfuses, becoming one of the steadily recurring surnames in Old Order Amish church directories through the 18 and 1900s. Amish historians who have compiled detailed family record books note that the Zook surname, much like Yoder, rarely appears in Mennonite congregational records from the same period, which strongly suggests the family stayed close to the Amish side of the 1793 split almost from its very beginning. The sociologist John Hostetler, whose book Amish Society became the standard academic reference on the community for decades after it was first published, spent much of his career documenting exactly this kind of surname clustering across the different settlements. Hershey, Mennonite, at its root. Christian Hershey, sometimes recorded in older documents as Hershey, was among the Swiss Mennonite families who settled in Lancaster County in the early 1700s, part of the same broad migration wave that brought the Herrs, the Landises, and the Brubakers across the same ocean around the same years. Generations later, in 1857, a descendant named Milton Hershey was born in Derry Township, in what is now Dauphin County, Pennsylvania. Milton's father drifted through several different religious affiliations over the course of his life, and Milton himself was not a practicing Mennonite as an adult, building instead a chocolate manufacturing empire so large that the company town built around his factory, Hershey, Pennsylvania, still carries the family name on every map of the state. But the family's documented roots trace directly back to those early 18th century Mennonite settlers, the same church, the same county, the same migration that shaped every other Mennonite name on this list. The chocolate empire and the town it built came generations later. The Mennonite farm in Lancaster County came first, and without it, there is no Hershey at all, no factory, no company town, no name printed on a foil wrapper in every corner store in the country. Not every German surname sorts this cleanly. Miller, the anglicized form of the German Muller, is common in both the Amish and Mennonite churches in roughly equal measure, spread across nearly every settlement from Lancaster to Holmes County to northern Indiana, and genealogists generally agree that no single Miller ancestor and no single migration wave explains the name's spread the way Nicholas Stoltzfus explains Stoltzfus, or Hans Herr explains Herr. Some names carry a documented split down the center of the family itself, rather than a clean answer on one side or the other, and Miller, one of the most common surnames in both churches combined, is the clearest example of one. A Miller family in Holmes County, Ohio, might be Amish for 6 generations running, while a Miller family 2 counties over in a Mennonite conference has no documented connection to them at all, sharing nothing but a common German trade name and an ocean crossing that happened somewhere in the same rough stretch of the 1700s. The Amish population in North America has grown past 400,000 people, almost entirely through birth rather than conversion, doubling roughly every 20 years because large families stay inside the church at a remarkably high rate, generation after generation. Mennonites are harder to count as a single number, precisely because so many Mennonite descendants, like the Hoovers and the Hersheys, drifted out of Old Order practice entirely while the surname stayed exactly where it started. Both patterns are visible in the 19 names above and the one that refuses to sort. Some surnames stayed inside the fence, generation after generation, the way Yoder and Stoltzfus and Fisher have. Others walked straight through it, into Quaker meeting houses and college museums and the White House, and simply kept the name on their way out. 19 names, most of them landing firmly on one side of a church argument that happened 300 years ago in a region of Europe most of their descendants will never visit. The Yoders and the Stoltzfuses and the Fischers and the Kings and the Bontragers and the Hochstetlers and the Beilers and the Troyers and the Hershbergers and the Zooks followed Jakob Ammann into a stricter, more visibly separated life, one that in many branches of those families still looks recognizably the same today as it did 3 centuries ago, right down to the horse and buggy on the same country roads their ancestors first cleared. The Herrs and the Landises and the Funks and the Groffs and the Ebbies and the Weavers and the Kauffmans and the Hoovers and the Hersheys stayed with the older Mennonite tradition and in more than one documented case drifted even further from it in the centuries that followed. Into Quaker meeting houses, into the White House, into chocolate factories and restaurant kitchens and college museums on the Kansas prairie, lives that would have been unrecognizable to the immigrants who first crossed the ocean carrying nothing but a trunk and a surname. Neither path was the wrong one. Both were the same people, the same faith, the same ships, split apart by one meeting in one autumn 300 years ago, and still today written quietly into the surname you carry, whether you have ever set foot in Lancaster County or not, and whether anyone in your family ever bothered to tell you the story behind the name they gave you. A name is rarely just a name. Follow it back far enough, in this particular corner of American history, and it almost always resolves into a choice somebody made in a room you will never see, about a church, a shunning, and a life plain enough to keep the world at arm's length. Some families are still living inside that choice today, in the same counties, on the same roads, 300 years later. Others left it behind so completely that the surname is the only thread still connecting them to it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.